Hey, how's it going? I'm going to talk today about Stalin's Children by Owen Matthews, 3 Generations of Love and War. I just finished it, literally, half an hour ago, sitting over there on the sofa and was moved. All kinds of thoughts, all kinds of feelings. He's a very evocative writer and he stirs up your emotions. So, yeah, I'll give you a wee bit of background on where this came from. I must have heard of it from somewhere because it was on the shelf and I don't remember buying it or what made me buy it. So, yeah, that's a shame because I'd like to remember what inspired me to buy it. What inspired me to read it at this particular time was that I heard the author on a podcast, Planet Normal. It's a news podcast in the UK, and Owen Matthews came on to talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict that's still happening. And he sounded very knowledgeable. I was like, wow, this sounds like a guy I should check out. And he mentioned during the discussion on the podcast that he'd written a book called Overreach, which is a history of the Ukraine and Russia conflict right up to 2022. I talked about that in my wrap-up video for May this year. And that book gives us a history of Russia and Ukraine, Putin and Zelensky, and then goes into the conflict. And I just found it amazingly fascinating. So when I was entering that book into my database on Notion, I saw that the author was already in my database. I was like, oh, really? What's going on there? So turns out I had this book. I'd also listened to him on another podcast where he was talking about Russia on the Empire podcast. So, yeah, I'd just forgotten his name, but he was already on my radar. So I took this off the shelf, had a quick look at it, and I was like, this sounds absolutely amazing. And it was. So it follows the story of his family, basically. His mother is Russian. Her father was Russian or Ukrainian, Soviet, depends on how you want to depict the nationalities there. He was purged in 1937 during Stalin's purges. He was an intellectual and became a party member. He worked at the tractor plant in Ukraine, and he was quite high up in the party, and then he made a mistake, said something he shouldn't have done, and ended up becoming a non-person. He got purged, he was killed, and Matthews talks about that early on in the book about going to the archives in Kiev, and once the archives were unlocked, he was able to look through like the death certificate, all the correspondence, the court trial, all of that stuff was, I can imagine it's an incredibly emotional thing for the author to do. I think he did that around 1990. And he also talks of the correspondence between his mother and his father, which took place. His father was Welsh, born in Swansea, grew up in poverty, and was a Russophile for some reason, felt the pull, the call, Russian language and culture and history, and I can relate to that. That's why I'm here. And I think that's why I loved this book so much, because I got to read about what it felt like to be someone with my passion in this region, what it might have been like back in the 50s and 60s, And it follows really the story of 3 generations, the story of the grandfather and his wife and their kids, who all of them become non-people after he gets taken away. The wife goes into Gulag in Kazakhstan, and the kids go off to an orphanage. There's 2 kids, 2 sisters. Lenina is the older one, and Lyudmila is the younger one. She's aged 3, I think, at this time. And Lenina's 9 years older. So these 2 sisters end up going around different orphanages, and they survive through the Great Patriotic War, which came very, very close to the orphanage where they were situated at the time in Ukraine. Or was it near Stalingrad? I can't remember the details, but there's a benefactor there, the man who runs the orphanage where they are. He saves the children basically by putting them on a raft, sending them up, is it the Volga? Sends them up the river just before the orphanage area gets taken over by the Nazis. So, I mean, what a life these kids had. It's unbelievable, so harsh. And the way it's written, it's so vivid. And it's good, obviously his mother has told him all these stories, and Owen Matthews has written them down in such an evocative way. As I said, it's so powerful. And it follows the story then, after we get through the story of the kids going through the orphanages and surviving the war, we get his father's story, Owen Matthews' father, who ends up in Russia during kind of turbulent times. I mean, is there ever not turbulent times in Russia? And long story short, he ends up falling in love with Lyudmila. The KGB have tried to recruit him. They've wined and dined him. He starts out in the diplomatic service, and that he doesn't take to that at all. So he leaves, and he ends up going to Russia as an exchange student. And that's when he's getting tailed. Doesn't know at the time, he's just hanging out with these Russian guys who he thinks are his friends, but they're not his friends, they're recruiters. And he refuses the offer to help the cause, and so then he becomes persona non grata, and he gets ejected from the Soviet Union, which is a problem because he's fallen in love. So we follow a love story, and it's so poignant for me because I was abroad for just under 2 years when I was courting my wife, and we got engaged kind of halfway through that period. But I was in Kazakhstan and she was in France and then Luxembourg, and it was a difficult time having a long distance relationship like that. Young couple in love and corresponding. I mean, luckily we had email, and also luckily there was no ideological curtain between us, just a long distance. And but I can remember saying cheerio at the airport after I'd come back home for a holiday. I think it was maybe 3 times a year I got back. And then at one time she came out to be with me for a couple of months in Kazakhstan. So, we had some time together, but it was very hard for Lyudmila and Mervyn. My God, 5 years they were apart. And through the book, there's some great photographic sections, and from the introduction that obviously they end up together. So, it's a non-fiction book. It's not like you're reading a novel where you need to hide the fact that, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, to read the story of their 5 years apart is quite poignant and difficult, especially for me with the experience I have of, going through that. But boy, oh boy. So we get their story and how Mervyn was able to have Lyudmila eventually get her exit visa from the Soviet Union. Loads of stories about Mervyn going into Russia, the ways that he got in when he shouldn't have been there. Very interesting to read about. Travelling from Finland to Tallinn and from Finland to St. Petersburg and meeting up for a few hours or for one night and then having to part again. And then he sneaks in again from Belgium, I think it was, by applying for a visa with a misspelling of his name. He's a very resourceful man. It's really an adventure story in some ways there. And it's interspersed with Matthew's own experiences as a young journalist in Moscow in the 90s, which I also experienced, albeit briefly. But, Ukraine and well, Ukraine in the 90s and then Kazakhstan in the early 2000s. So, I could feel a little bit of what he was talking about, but I know that Moscow in the 90s was just mental, and he covers it very well with his own experiences of being there as a journalist. And, when the wall came down, he was, where did he say he was? In Vienna? I can't remember where he said he was. No, he was in Leningrad, I think. When the coup was going on, when the hardline Soviet communists tried to take over the White House, and Gorbachev was in, where was he? Sochi, I think it was, somewhere in the Crimea. He was under house arrest and all that. So Owen Matthews was in Russia at the time, and he said he couldn't watch it on TV because the TV stations had been taken over by the hardliners. Imagine being in the country during all that. It must have been such a thrill. But anyway, he was there when the wall came down, and all through the 90s he talks about going out clubbing and about the crime and corruption, and it's just what a scene. What a scene. There's a good friend of mine I know who, when I was in Ukraine for a year, she was in Moscow for a year, and I know some of her experiences were pretty harrowing. We've lost touch now, which is a shame because she was a good friend. Anyway, yeah, Moscow in the 90s. So the way he writes about that, it's portrayed so well, so vividly, so clearly. There's lots of little bits. I ended up writing down a few quotations in it that stood out to me. So I'll go through some of them now. He's talking about his mother, and she says, as a youngster, "We must be worthy of their belief in us. We must fight. We have no right to be weak. Life will crush us in a minute, and no one will hear our cries." Yeah, it's quite moving, isn't it? Like many Russian intellectuals of her generation, she is utterly at home in the dense Kasbah of her country's literature, navigating its alleys like a native daughter. I just loved that, because I know from my own experience that even the Russian youth seem to be much more well versed in their own culture and literature than in the West. That's how I felt about it. So, yeah, I think that's a very poignant quotation. She was one of those portly, invincible, middle-aged Russian women whose kind lurked like Dobermans in the front offices of all Russia's great men. They ruled ticket offices and lorded it over hotel reception desks. Made me think of going to the post office in Odessa when one of these women behind the counter, "Это твоя проблема." That's that's the scene that sticks in my head. It's your problem. I was trying to get something sorted out, and yeah, these big Russian strong women. He's described it well. And the all-important file, we were all forced to follow its course now step by step, because what had been written could not be unwritten. Owen gets beaten up in Russia by 3 drunk guys, just kind of randomly, and he ends up, the police get involved, and these guys get picked up and they get convicted of assault or whatever it is, and they go to prison. And at one point, Owen Matthews tries to have the charges dropped. That's what this was about. And they say, no, you can't. It's not possible to drop the charges now. You've got to follow the paperwork. So the bureaucracy of Russia hasn't changed between the 30s right up to the 90s. Many Russians, I believe, carry a similar black slime inside themselves, made of trauma and guilt and willful forgetting. It makes a rich compost in which all their hedonism, their treachery, their every pleasure and betrayal takes root. So he's just trying to figure out what makes the Russians of the 90s the way that they are. This black slime that they've carried. Oh, it's beautiful. And this is a bit about Lyudmila. She said at one point later in life that childhood hunger stays with you your whole life. You can never ever feel truly full again. And obviously, growing up as an orphan, you get to know hunger pretty well, and it never leaves. So this is part of the black slime, I suppose, from the last quotation. The kitchen became Leonina's kingdom, and food was the currency of her love. So Leonina remembers the big sister. And I know that Russians have an innate fondness for eating well, for putting on a great spread, and entertaining. Hospitality is a big deal over there. And yeah, this summed it up well for me. Solzhenitsyn named the network of prison camps which stretched across the Soviet Union the Gulag Archipelago. But in truth, all of Russia is an archipelago, a string of isolated islands of warmth and light, strung out in a hostile sea of emptiness. So this is how he feels when he's flying to Siberia. He's looking out the plane window and he sees the towns dotted throughout the wilderness. And yeah, the vastness of that part of the world just boggles the mind, you know, and how those parts of the world became inhabited, well, partly through the Gulag system. The Gulags were small shanty towns that the labourers built up into towns. Da Boga vysoko, do tsarya daliko. That's a little Russian saying that I hadn't heard before. God is high and the Tsar is far away. So they're talking about what life is like out in these remote places, these remote parts of Russia. That, you know, what's going on in Moscow, that's miles away, doesn't concern us, and God's high up in heaven. So Moscow, I found, seemed to attract people who were ferociously smart, but often hungry and damaged, fleeing failure or trying to prove something to the world. Like a traumatic love affair, it could change people forever. And, like a love affair or a drug, it would be exhilarating at first, but then, as it wore on, it reclaimed the buzz it had given with interest. So this is Owen talking about his time in Moscow in the 90s. That time of hedonism, which, you know, he partook in. He was out having fun and living the life. He was assigned to basically report for the Moscow Times on what he could find. He was just given an assignment to go out and seek the streets of Moscow and find stories for the paper. So he was out, and he had a girlfriend at one time, a beautiful girlfriend, in fact, who's described in great detail. And she ends up in a bad way. I won't spoil that because that's an interesting part of the story. But yeah, it's a great part of the book when he discusses his relationship in Moscow. Russia certainly had a definite appeal for anyone with a dark streak of gross irresponsibility and self-destructiveness. And if you had it, there was nothing to stop you indulging it. It was a weird, godless world where values went into permanent suspended animation, and you were terrifyingly free to explore the nastiest recesses of your own black heart. Wow. Yeah, I don't know if it was for me. What age was I in Ukraine? 26, I think, 25, 26. When I spent a year in Odessa from 95 to 96. And I was in pretty wild times as well. Ukraine particularly then was in a city as well, so I was living in the middle of the city. Yeah, it was pretty wild. Not as wild as Moscow, but, you know, it had its own thing going on. After a life as actors in a great drama, they found the hardest thing was simply to become human again. So that's near the end, and we've got Mervyn and Ludmilla back together again, and it discusses how those 5 years of drama, of living in epistolary relationship, when that ended, it was like, it says that the struggle itself was almost like a means to an end. and when they get back together to live their lives in London. Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and it's relatable, you know. But I think for me, having read through this and having, you know, as I said, experienced a kind of long distance relationship, which I'm happy to say came to an end, and now we're happily married for 23 years. You know, it's got me feeling grateful for what I have, where I am, who I'm with, for the life that I've had. It's also got me wondering, you know, what my life could have been like if I'd ended up carrying on as a linguist and living over in these parts of the world. Because, you know, that region does still call to me. It's still in here, and I kid myself on. I think that I want to be there, and that every time I was there was when I was happiest. But I know that that's not true, because my wife constantly reminds me. She says, "You hated it out there." I'm like, well, did I? It's funny how memory can kind of colour things. I mean, we had our own adventure in Moscow, the two of us, when we were young lovers, and this is before I got the job in Kazakhstan, and we'd gone to Sochi together to teach English. And there was a time when we were teaching English in a private school, and the boss of the private school, corrupt guy, ex-Soviet type, you know, he had a lot of Western teachers of English come over and become disillusioned with where they were teaching and then just disappear. So in order to prevent that from happening, he took our passports away from us and wouldn't give them back. So we basically couldn't go anywhere. And most of the teachers he had didn't know Russian, but we did. So, well, first of all, we went to the embassy and we were like, "Can you help us get our passports back?" And they said no, which I found a bit strange. But being Russian speakers, we were able to look up the foreign labour law, and we found the part that pertained to under what circumstances passports could be withheld, none of which applied to us. And so we armed ourselves with this legislation and went to the OVIR, which is the sort of registry place where foreign visas are issued and stuff like that. And that gets mentioned a lot in Stalin's Children about Owen Matthews going to the OVIR. So we went to the OVIR with the legislation and said, "Look, we need our passports back. We've got this legislation and we'll take it further." I mean, were we bluffing? And I don't think we were. But they eventually relented and gave us our passports back. So then you can guess what we did after that. Midnight flit back to England. So yeah, I think that's why this book speaks to me. And about that pool of that region, I do hope I'll go back one day. I've never been to Petersburg. That's a place I really need to go. My wife has been and she loved it, absolutely loved it. So I'd like to think I'll go back there at some point. Go there at some point. But yeah, I'm never going to end up working out there or travelling, I don't think. Those days are gone. But I'm glad I've got the experiences that I have. You know, that's something I treasure and something that's still in here. So yeah, that's Stalin's Children. Highly, highly recommend it if you're at all interested in this region of the world. Or just a great memoir about love and about hardship and trauma with happy endings. And obviously Owen Matthews is still very much around doing his thing, going on podcasts and publishing books about the region. And to have someone with his background and knowledge out there giving us more opinion and information, I'm very grateful for that. So if you ever get to see this, Owen Matthews, thank you for writing this wonderful book. And if you do have a blog or something, I'd love to see some more photos, because there weren't enough. Show some wedding photos at least, you know, that would be appreciated. And thanks all of you for watching. Catch you again in another review. See you later. До свидания. Пока. Счастливо.